The American M4 Sherman tank was never built to terrify. It was built to last. Across the fields of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the frozen forests of Belgium, this steel giant became the face of Allied armour. To the Germans it seemed ordinary, even inferior. But hidden inside, beneath the rattling hull and roaring engine, was something they never suspected. A secret weapon, not of steel or firepower, but of sound and signal. The radio. By 1943, German panzer divisions were still relying on short-range, unreliable sets that faltered under movement and static. Only commanders had radios. Most crews depended on hand signals and flares. The battlefield was loud, chaotic, and slow to react. Meanwhile, the United States Army was installing one of the most advanced battlefield communication systems in the world. Every Sherman rolled out of the factory with an SCR 508 FM radio, connected to an intercom net for the entire crew. 5 men could speak, listen, and coordinate in real time, without shouting, without confusion. At first glance, it was a simple feature, but in the heat of battle, it became the difference between life and death. In the early days of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, field manuals emphasized one phrase again and again: communication is firepower. A tank that could talk was worth more than a tank that could roar. And when hundreds of tanks could talk to each other, the battlefield changed forever. The SCR 508 used frequency modulation, a technology the Germans dismissed as unnecessary. But FM signals cut through static and interference. Rain, dust, and engine noise no longer drowned commands. American tankers could hear orders clearly while on the move, even under artillery fire. To German troops listening across the front, the airwaves were silent. They never realized the Americans were whispering across invisible channels, plotting each move with surgical precision. Inside a Sherman, the soundscape was unique. The driver called out terrain changes, the gunner confirmed range, the commander relayed updates from nearby units. Every voice layered over the hum of the engine, a symphony of coordination. The German panzer crews, in contrast, often rode in isolation. Only the platoon leader could radio higher command. The rest followed visual cues, flags raised from turret hatches or coloured smoke grenades. In the dust and chaos, visibility vanished. By the time an order reached them, the battlefield had already changed. Historians often compare the Sherman and the Panzer by armour thickness or gun calibre, but rarely do they compare their silence. When the 75mm shells fired from a Sherman, the real impact wasn't just in steel, it was in synchronization. One tank spotted, another adjusted, a third flanked. Without hesitation, without delay, it was a ballet conducted through static-free voices, not shouted across wind and fear. The Germans never fully understood how the Americans coordinated so quickly. Reports from captured panzer officers mentioned unusual speed of maneuver. They assumed the Allies had more tanks or better maps. In reality, they had better ears. As one US tanker later recalled, "Our radios talked us out of ambushes." He meant it literally. When one Sherman was hit, the rest immediately shifted formation, returning fire before the smoke cleared. Information traveled faster than bullets. Even infantry units benefited. Each Sherman radio could tune into the company net, linking tanks with ground troops and artillery. A squad pinned down in a hedgerow could speak directly to armour for support within seconds. That level of coordination stunned the enemy. To the Germans, the Sherman was predictable. They mocked its high profile, thin armour, and tendency to burn. Yet its true strength was invisible. In an era where seconds meant survival, the Americans had shortened the gap between thought and action. What they lacked in raw firepower, they made up for in communication discipline. A doctrine trained from the very first day of boot camp. Every soldier learned the same radio brevity codes, from generals to tank gunners. Orders were concise, unambiguous, and repeatable under stress. The Wehrmacht system, built on hierarchy and field runners, lagged behind. Even late-war innovations like the Fuji-5 could not match the stability of American FM clarity. As spring 1944 unfolded, Allied intelligence reports confirmed a strange trend. German armor units often engaged late or scattered after initial contact. They couldn't coordinate counterattacks effectively once communication lines broke. This unseen breakdown would become one of the silent factors behind the Allied advance. Inside the command tents, radio operators plotted the future war on maps. Headphones pressed tight, voices steady. Red 1 to Blue 2, advance 200 yards, hold fire, confirm target. Each message, carried through the ether, rewrote the rhythm of modern warfare. In retrospect, the Sherman's radio network was not glamorous. It did not roar or shine like armor plate. It hummed softly, a pulse that connected men, machines, and momentum. For the Germans, the silence between their own tanks grew heavier each day. By the time they realized what was happening, the Allied formations were already beyond the horizon. A war that had begun with steel and thunder was now being fought through invisible waves. The battlefield of World War II was not just fought in mud and steel. It was fought in signals, in the invisible realm between sound and silence. Every Sherman tank carried not just ammunition, but connectivity. A radio net linked platoons, companies, and even aircraft overhead. When one unit moved, others adjusted in perfect rhythm. It was an orchestra conducted through static, and the Germans could never hear the music. In 1944, American armored divisions entering Normandy were trained to operate as fluid, modular teams. A platoon leader could contact artillery support, call for air reconnaissance, or redirect infantry, all within seconds. The SCR 508's FM transmission made it possible to form radio nets, shared frequencies where multiple tanks and command posts exchanged live updates. Each division had dozens of such nets: command net, artillery net, air liaison net, logistics net, each one alive with calm voices reading coordinates and confirmation codes. It was the first battlefield internet, a connected ecosystem decades before the digital age. For German commanders, coordination meant dispatch riders or field telephones strung along roads. Once those lines were cut, orders vanished into chaos. Messages could take half an hour to reach a platoon. By then, the Americans had already shifted position, flanked, and struck again. A single Allied tank company could operate with near-instant awareness. If the lead tank spotted movement, it radioed back, and the formation adjusted like a living organism. It was not luck. It was information dominance. Military analysts after the war called this situational compression. In essence, the Americans had shrunk time. They could act faster than the enemy could think. A captured German report from 1944 admitted, "Enemy armored forces appear to anticipate our maneuvers almost immediately." They didn't realize it wasn't anticipation. It was communication. The Germans often jammed radio frequencies, but the American FM system resisted interference better than their AM-based transmitters. The clear tone and resilience of frequency modulation meant that even in storm or smoke, the net remained stable. For the men inside the Sherman, that reliability meant trust. They believed their voices would be heard, and they were. Tank commanders could coordinate with infantry leaders using backpack radios like the SCR 300. When a platoon was pinned down, all it took was one calm transmission. Tango 1, this is Thunder. Smoke at your left. Advancing now. Within minutes, the tanks rolled into position, the infantry pushed forward, and the field quieted. No messengers, no confusion. Just the steady pulse of communication holding the front together. The radio also redefined leadership. A commander no longer needed to be in the front tank. He could lead from a ridge or hidden position while maintaining real-time oversight through voice reports. That flexibility saved lives and preserved structure when chaos struck. In the German panzer divisions, by contrast, loss of a single commander often meant paralysis. Orders broke down and initiative faded. Even the famed Tiger tanks suffered from this dependency. The Allies had something far more adaptable, a distributed system of command built on communication rather than rank. Every man's microphone carried authority in moments of crisis. As American armor advanced deeper into France, logistics officers realized another hidden strength. The same radio technology that guided tanks could also move supplies. Fuel convoys and repair teams stayed in constant contact. A truck driver lost in the rain could call in his position. A mechanic could coordinate recovery for a disabled tank without delay. The entire machine of war became self-correcting. This invisible network of coordination turned chaos into flow, and it all traced back to the quiet hum of the SCR 508. In one after-action report from the 4th Armoured Division, a commander wrote, "Our radios allowed us to fight like a single mind. The enemy never understood how quickly we could regroup." That statement would later define the American way of war. Decentralized, fast, and flexible. It wasn't about having the biggest gun or thickest armor. It was about connecting every soldier into one synchronized rhythm. In many ways, the Sherman's greatest weapon was its voice. Historians studying Allied success often look to industrial output or sheer numbers, but behind those numbers was communication, the silent multiplier, a force that could share awareness, outperformed one that couldn't, regardless of raw strength. Even when Shermans faced superior German tanks like the Panther or Tiger, the radios gave them a tactical edge. They could surround, withdraw, or bait the enemy with coordinated precision. It turned numerical inferiority into strategic advantage. The Germans never adapted fully. By the time they tried to retrofit universal radios, resources were gone and the war was collapsing. The SCR 508's design simplicity was also key. It used standardized crystal frequencies, making it easy to switch channels if one became compromised. Training manuals taught every operator basic maintenance and quick tuning. In contrast, German sets required specialized technicians and frequent recalibration. A field operator could strip and rewire an American radio in minutes. That practicality meant constant uptime, and uptime meant survival. In post-war analysis, communication historians called it the invisible edge, an edge that could not be bombed, armored, or sabotaged easily. It existed in discipline, clarity, and confidence. It was, as one British officer remarked, the quiet miracle of the American tank. By mid-1944, German intelligence finally intercepted patterns of Allied coordination. But without access to FM decoding equipment, they couldn't listen in. The battlefield had become not only physical, but also informationally encrypted, and in that invisible realm, the Allies were unbeatable. The German panzer divisions were feared for their precision. Their armor was thick. Their guns were powerful. Their tactics, lightning fast. But beneath that image of strength lay a quiet flaw, a flaw made of silence. By 1944, the German army still treated radios as a luxury, not a necessity. Only platoon leaders or company commanders had full radio sets. Ordinary panzer crews relied on hand signals, colored flags, and visual contact. In the smoke and chaos of combat, those signals disappeared. The enemy did not have to jam their frequencies. The battlefield itself did the job. Inside each panzer, 5 men shared one space, but not one voice. The driver could not speak to the commander directly. The loader shouted above the roar of the engine. Every command was relayed through gestures or guesses. For the soldiers who lived and died inside those steel coffins, silence was deadly. The most common German tank radio, the Fuji-5, used amplitude modulation. It was sensitive to interference. Rough terrain, gunfire, or even the vibration of the engine caused static. Messages faded, broke, or vanished entirely. A tank unit in the middle of combat might receive half a sentence before the signal drowned. A moment's delay could mean destruction. One report from the 116th Panzer Division during the Normandy campaign described it simply. Our communications were insufficient. Commanders could not be reached during battle. The Panzer was powerful, but it was deaf. Contrast that with the Americans, each Sherman able to speak and listen simultaneously. To the Germans, that kind of communication seemed excessive. They believed discipline and experience would compensate. But the modern battlefield no longer waited for discipline. Every second mattered, and silence, once seen as strength, became a liability. German tank doctrine before the war emphasized central control. Orders came from above, exact, detailed, unchanging. Once battle began, initiative was limited. Without radios linking every vehicle, adapting on the move was almost impossible. When a commander was destroyed, the entire formation froze. Without his voice, the rest of the unit became a scattered collection of isolated machines. In many engagements, panzer platoons entered the fight in perfect formation and left in confusion. The problem was not courage, it was communication. A German tanker later recalled, "We saw smoke signals and flags, but never knew if they were for us or another unit." He described battles fought blind, hearing explosions, seeing flashes, but receiving no word of direction. The chaos multiplied under Allied air attacks. When dive bombers struck, field telephones were cut and radio nets overloaded. The command chain dissolved into static. German crews often fought alone, unaware of where friendly units were or how far the enemy had advanced. The front was everywhere and nowhere. Inside a Tiger tank, the armor was thick enough to stop a shell, but it also trapped every sound, a deafening roar of engine, gears, and gunfire. Communication through headsets was distorted and incomplete. If a tank commander shouted, his words were swallowed by the noise. In some cases, crews banged on the turret wall to signal direction. Others used colored lights or hand mirrors to reflect commands across open terrain. But when fog and smoke rolled in, those signals vanished. The German war machine, once known for precision, had become a prisoner of its own silence. Even strategic communications faltered. Field headquarters depended on landline telephones vulnerable to artillery and sabotage. When those cables were cut, divisions went dark for hours. During the Battle of the Bulge, several German units advanced without knowing where their neighboring forces were. Coordination collapsed and confusion spread like wildfire. By the time new orders arrived, the Americans had already repositioned their armor, guided by radios that never stopped talking. The psychological cost was immense. Tank crews began to distrust command. Some ignored orders they never clearly heard. Others hesitated to move for fear of friendly fire. That hesitation was fatal. Against an army built on communication speed, silence killed more than bullets. After the war, historians studied the communication gap as a critical factor in Germany's decline. They found that panzer divisions spent nearly 30% longer coordinating attacks than American units of equal size. Each minute lost on the battlefield translated into territory, lives, and momentum. Technology alone did not lose the war, but the absence of communication sealed its fate. The irony was painful. Germany had pioneered radio science before the war. Its engineers were world leaders in broadcasting and signal theory, but military conservatism and overconfidence in rigid control turned innovation into stagnation. While the Allies advanced through open dialogue and coordination, the Axis powers drowned in static. A former German signals officer wrote years later, "We underestimated the power of talking." He admitted that their tanks, for all their might, were mute giants. The statement echoed through post-war analysis rooms. It captured a truth that reshaped military doctrine for decades to come, that information, not armor, decides survival. Every victory has a hidden equation. For the American Tank Corps, that equation was measured not in millimeters of armor, but in megahertz of frequency. The SCR-508 wasn't just a radio, it was an entire philosophy of war built around clarity, developed by the Signal Corps and produced by companies like Galvan Manufacturing, later known as Motorola. The SCR-508 introduced a quiet revolution. Frequency modulation, or FM. Before FM, radios used amplitude modulation, AM. The same system used by commercial broadcasts. It worked fine in the open air of a city. But on a battlefield full of engines, gunfire, and interference, AM turned into chaos. Every burst of noise became a wave of static. FM solved that. It filtered noise, stabilized signal strength, and allowed clear voice transmission even in motion. For the first time, tanks could talk through storms, dust, and thunder without distortion. The design was simple, but brilliant. A single dial controlled 40 preset channels. Tank crews could switch frequencies within seconds. A clear tone signaled when the frequency locked in. Each vehicle was assigned a net, forming a living mesh of coordination that could stretch miles across the front. A platoon leader might be on Channel 1, a company commander on Channel 2, artillery, liaison on 5, all linked through a chain of overlapping networks, allowing smooth handoffs from one unit to another. Inside the Sherman, the radio sat directly behind the commander's seat. A heavy steel casing protected it from shrapnel. To the right of the gunner, a control box connected every crew headset to the intercom circuit. 5 men, driver, bow gunner, loader, gunner, commander, could all speak simultaneously. It turned a 5-man crew into one thinking organism. The intercom alone changed tactics. Instead of relying on shouted commands or shoulder taps, the crew now heard every heartbeat of the battle in sync. Orders flowed like water, calm, clear, unstoppable. Engineers who designed the SCR-508 knew it had to be soldier-proof. The knobs were large enough for gloved hands. The frequency scale glowed faintly in red to preserve night vision. A single power cable connected to the tank's battery system, ensuring constant voltage even while moving. Field manuals trained every tank operator to maintain, tune, and troubleshoot their own set. No need for specialists. Every crew became a communications team. Technically, the SCR-508 operated between 20 and 27.9 MHz, transmitting with 25 watts of power, enough to reach 7 to 10 miles in open terrain. That range may seem short today, but in 1944, it was revolutionary. It meant that every platoon could stay in direct voice contact without relying on headquarters. Decision-making compressed from minutes to seconds. That compression turned flexibility into dominance. In training grounds back in Fort Knox, soldiers learned that radio discipline was as important as gunnery. They practiced brevity codes, Able 1 to Baker 3, advance to tree line, hold. Every syllable mattered. Every pause carried weight. It was military mindfulness, the science of saying just enough. German intelligence tried to intercept these transmissions, but failed to understand their structure. The FM band produced short-clipped bursts, often mistaken for background noise. Even when recorded, the modulation curve couldn't be read without proper demodulators. In effect, the Sherman was speaking a language the enemy couldn't hear. Not because it was encrypted, but because it was modern. The simplicity of the SCR-508 belied its impact. When hundreds of tanks moved in coordination, their overlapping transmissions created a rhythm, a heartbeat across the front. It wasn't chaotic, it was orchestrated. Each operator knew when to speak, when to listen, when to stay silent. That etiquette, drilled endlessly in training, made every message count. No chatter, no panic, just crisp precision. As engineers reviewed post-combat data, they realized something profound. The SCR-508 was doing more than connecting tanks. It was rewiring the psychology of warfare. When soldiers could communicate, fear diminished. Uncertainty turned into trust. Trust built speed, and speed won battles. Psychologists later observed that radio communication reduced combat stress by 20% among armored crews. The human mind performs better when it is heard. The SCR-508 also scaled beyond tanks. It became the core of a broader communication network linking armor, infantry, artillery, and air support. Jeep-mounted versions, half-track command variants, and portable backpack models extended the web of clarity across Europe. Every American advance, from Normandy to the Siegfried Line, was guided by invisible voices carried on these frequencies. By contrast, the German signal network grew weaker. The Luftwaffe, the Heer, and the Kriegsmarine all operated on incompatible systems. Their frequencies overlapped, causing interference even among their own branches. No single doctrine unified their communication. The Allies had created a language of war, concise, structured, universal. The Axis still spoke in dialects. In one archived field test after the war, engineers recreated the SCR 508 next to a captured Fuji 5. When both radios operated side by side, the difference was startling. The Fuji 5 crackled, hissed, and faded. The SCR 508 remained clean and clear, even under simulated bombardment. The test lasted 30 minutes, the verdict permanent. The Americans had mastered not only sound, but signal stability under chaos. That mastery became doctrine. Future armoured warfare manuals declared, the radio is the sixth man in every crew. It was no longer optional equipment, it was identity. And with it, the Sherman tank became something new. Not just a weapon, but a node in a living network. The science of clarity had turned into the art of command. When the engine of a Sherman came alive, so did its voices. 5 men, 1 tank, 1 shared heartbeat. In the darkness before dawn, they checked the headsets, testing each line, one by one. Driver, check in. Driver ready. Gunner, clear. Loader standing by. Commander online. And with that, a 5-ton machine became a living mind. Each voice had a rhythm. Steady, familiar, human. Inside the steel walls, those voices replaced fear. They were the sound of connection in a world made of chaos. The intercom wasn't just a tool, it was a bond. When shells burst nearby, the voices steadied each other. When smoke blinded their periscope, the words guided them through. Courage, it turned out, didn't always shout. Sometimes it spoke softly through static. American tank crews were trained not to act as individuals, but as extensions of communication itself. Every man had a role. Every role depended on the others. The driver kept his eyes low. He couldn't see the battlefield, only the narrow slit ahead. The gunner focused on targets he often couldn't fully visualize. The loader worked blind, trusting rhythm and timing. The bow gunner scanned flanks and reloaded the coaxial. The commander saw everything, through sound. He listened to the voices and shaped the fight with calm words. That calmness became the soul of the Sherman. In reports from the 3rd Armoured Division, tank commanders described communication as the heartbeat of coordination. When one tank was hit, the rest didn't panic. They adjusted instantly, forming defense lines, shifting fire, protecting survivors. It wasn't instinct, it was communication discipline, forged through repetition. On open fields or among hedgerows, this clarity gave courage form. No man felt alone. Even under fire, they could hear their comrades breathing, speaking, surviving. One veteran recalled a moment near St. Lo, Normandy. We were down to 3 tanks. Smoke everywhere. I could barely see the barrel ahead. Then the radio crackled. Stay tight, Blue 2. We're not done yet. That voice, it pulled us back into the fight. He paused before adding, we fought for that voice, not the medal. Every radio message had weight, a mix of command and reassurance. Hold steady. Left flank, move. You're not alone. The words may have been brief, but they carried the essence of leadership. Not loud, but consistent. Historians later noted that this internal dialogue changed combat psychology. The human mind processes threat differently when connected. Heart rates stabilize, reaction time sharpens, morale endures. Inside a Sherman, courage was a shared frequency. The German experience was different. Their tanks, though powerful, isolated their men. One misheard command could doom an entire platoon. The contrast grew visible as the war dragged on. Allied formations flowed like rivers, bending and adapting to terrain. German units fought like pillars, strong but rigid. The difference was communication, courage shaped by connection. For Allied commanders, this network also transformed command philosophy. Orders no longer needed to travel up and down long chains. Field officers could adapt in seconds, relaying updates directly between tank groups. Flexibility replaced rigidity. It was courage guided by trust, the confidence that every voice would be heard clearly, without distortion or delay. Sherman crews often gave their tanks names. Lucky Lady, Georgia Peach, Betty Lou. To outsiders, it seemed sentimental. But for the men inside, naming the machine meant giving personality to the voice that linked them all. Each tank's call sign became part of a living family. Georgia Peach, covering left. Lucky Lady, advancing 200 yards. Copy that. Betty Lou. Those exchanges were small miracles, fragments of human warmth amid mechanical war. Tank intercom chatter, recorded after the war, reveals laughter even during combat. Small jokes, bits of song, one-liners between reloads. It wasn't bravado, it was survival. When death surrounded them, humor was proof that connection still existed. As one radio operator later said, "We never felt alone in a Sherman, not once." Psychologists studying these interactions decades later describe the phenomenon as group coherence under duress. When voices remained stable, fear fragmented and lost power. It's the same principle used in modern cockpit teams and emergency response units. Calm communication saves lives. The Sherman crews of World War II were unknowingly the prototypes of that system. Even when tanks burned, the last thing many heard wasn't explosion, but a voice. "We've got you. Hold on." That voice, transmitted through static, symbolized what made Allied armor unstoppable. It wasn't the machine. It was the men who refused to fall silent. When the war finally turned in favor of the Allies, analysts at the Pentagon summarized the advantage in one line: "Our coordination exceeded their confusion." A sterile phrase, but behind it lay thousands of voices, intertwined through noise, smoke, and fear. Those voices weren't just commands, they were courage given sound. The fog of war is not a metaphor. It is real, thick, choking, and silent. For the German panzer crews of 1944, that silence became their greatest enemy. By the summer of that year, the once mighty armoured divisions were shrinking. Fuel shortages, destroyed supply lines, and Allied air dominance made every movement a gamble. But deeper than those wounds was a fracture inside their own system. A silence that spread through the ranks. Orders no longer reached the front in time. Field commanders guessed positions, assuming where their allies might be. Entire platoons drove into battle unaware that others had already fallen back. Each tank fought its own war. The German radio nets, when they worked, were filled with static and confusion. Messages overlapped, frequencies jammed, batteries failed. The Fuji 5 and its variants strained to keep pace with the movement of modern war. The once feared coordination of Blitzkrieg, that lightning strike of 1939, was gone. Its speed had always depended on communication. Now, in 1944, the lightning had burned out. Reports from the Eastern Front told the same story. Command posts waited hours for replies. Artillery support never arrived because the coordinates were lost in transmission. Pilots circled above empty fields, waiting for signals that never came. Inside the tanks, the silence felt endless. The commander shouted. The driver heard nothing. The loader waited for orders that never came. And outside, the Allies moved like a tide, speaking through invisible threads of radio clarity. At the Battle of Falaise Pocket, the collapse became complete. Encircled German units tried desperately to communicate through failing transmitters. "Repeat! Repeat! Position unknown." One message crackled before vanishing into static. The Luftwaffe could not locate them. The artillery fired blindly. What remained of the panzer divisions fought in isolation, blind, deaf, and exhausted. For the soldiers trapped inside their machines, the sound of silence became unbearable. German field diaries from that period read more like confessions than records. One officer wrote, "The silence between us is the sound of defeat." Another scrawled, "We no longer hear our comrades, only the engine, that engine." Once the symbol of power had become a prison wall of noise. Each tank was its own island, sealed in metal, surrounded by chaos. Endurance was no longer about holding ground. It was about staying sane. Crews developed habits to cope with the silence. Some tapped Morse-like signals on the turret walls. Others used gunfire patterns to indicate location. 2 short bursts for "still alive," the battlefield, became a desperate conversation through fire. Yet even that system failed when ammunition ran low. The war had turned into whispers, and then into nothing. Allied reports from the Ardennes later confirmed what intelligence had suspected. The German army had collapsed not from lack of courage, but from lack of communication. Their formations still fought fiercely. Their tanks still struck hard. But they could not hear each other. It was a war of echoes. One side connected, the other lost in silence. When American engineers inspected captured Panzer command posts, they found tangled wires and burnt-out transmitters. The operators had tried to patch systems with spare parts from civilian radios. Some used bicycle dynamos to power field sets when batteries died. They endured, but endurance without connection is just waiting for defeat. By late 1944, even the high command felt the silence. Berlin sent orders that took days to reach the front. Entire divisions had already been destroyed before the messages arrived. The gap between command and reality widened until the chain of war simply snapped. It wasn't the bombs that broke the Wehrmacht. It was the pause between sentences. Psychologists later described the phenomenon as auditory, deprivation under stress. Human minds are wired for response. When no response comes, disorientation sets in. Soldiers inside tanks reported dizziness, loss of time, even hallucinations during long silent waits. They would speak into broken radios for comfort, knowing no one could hear. That silence, invisible, mechanical, merciless, drained the last strength from the German armoured force. In contrast, Allied tankers continued their rhythm, every minute filled with coordination, chatter, updates, laughter. Their endurance came from communication, the ability to share the burden of fear. German endurance came from isolation, and isolation breaks faster than steel. One American after-action report summed it bluntly. Their armor fought like ghosts, appearing, firing, then vanishing into confusion. For all their power, the Panzer divisions were ghosts of their former selves. Wandering in a battlefield they could no longer hear. As winter came, snow covered the wrecks of those once mighty machines. The radios inside were silent, frozen relics of an age that had ended in static. The sound of defeat was not an explosion, it was the absence of a voice. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The greatest amphibious invasion in history, but beneath the thunder of artillery and the storm of steel, another invasion was unfolding, an invasion of sound. The Allies didn't just land with tanks and troops, they landed with networks. From the beaches to the hedgerows, every Sherman tank, every jeep, every infantry platoon was connected by radio. The air crackled not with chaos but coordination. Voices filled the static like music, calm, steady, relentless. Red Dog, advance to marker. Blue Fox, cover left. Confirm contact. It was the language of precision, the rhythm of organization amidst disorder. The Germans expected confusion. They expected chaos on the beaches. Instead, they faced a synchronized machine powered by communication. When one landing craft was hit, another took its place. When a tank bogged down in the sand, a recovery unit was already en route, guided by radio. The web of connections stretched from Omaha to Utah, from command ships offshore to platoons fighting inland. The entire invasion breathed in unison. At dawn, as the first Sherman tanks rolled through the narrow roads of Normandy, the radio nets lit up. Tank commanders spoke to infantry leaders directly, coordinating every turn. Artillery spotters relayed corrections from the air. And somewhere above, pilots listened to the same frequencies, ready to respond. It was not just an assault, it was a symphony, each note precise, each pause intentional. For the Germans, that precision was devastating. Their defensive bunkers, designed to repel mass attacks, now faced small, coordinated strikes. Each Allied movement seemed pre-planned, each counterattack predicted. They never understood that the true weapon was invisible. At headquarters aboard the USS Ancon, communication officers monitored dozens of frequencies. Reports streamed in from every sector. Tango Charlie clear. Eagle 5 secured. Bridgehead. Gold 6 needs engineer support. The flow of information was so seamless that senior commanders could visualize the battle. In near real time, something unheard of before, Normandy, what the Germans saw as luck was actually synchronization. On the ground, tank crews relied entirely on radio discipline. When hedgerows blocked sightlines, they coordinated blind through voices. Left turn 50 meters, enemy at barn. Hold fire. The tanks moved like dancers through fields of smoke and fear. To the infantry, those calm voices were lifelines. A single call for help could summon support within minutes. And as each position fell, the radio nets adjusted automatically. One unit's success fueling the next advance. The battlefield evolved faster than the enemy could comprehend. Historians later named it the Normandy Network. Not a formal system, but a phenomenon. Thousands of men across land, sea, and air connected through overlapping radio frequencies, all operating under one doctrine: communicate first, move second. This principle transformed warfare. The invasion succeeded not because of sheer power, but because it eliminated confusion, the oldest enemy of war. German defenders tried to respond, but their lines of communication broke within hours. Cables were destroyed by naval bombardment. Messengers were cut off by paratroopers. Their radios, limited and fragile, could not reach through the noise. By midday, their command posts operated in isolation. Some units still believed the main invasion was coming elsewhere. By the time truth reached them, the Allies were already miles inland. A German officer later wrote, "We were fighting an army that could hear itself think." That realization came too late. In one critical moment near Carentan, a Sherman platoon used its radios to coordinate with P-47 Thunderbolts above. Enemy armor was spotted forming behind the ridge. Within 2 minutes, the tanks relayed coordinates directly to the pilots. Within 5, the ridge erupted under rocket fire. It was one of the first true joint air-ground operations conducted entirely by real-time radio, and it changed everything. As the campaign pushed deeper into France, the same pattern repeated. Communication replaced chaos. Speed replaced confusion. The Allied advance became unstoppable because it was unified by sound. At every stage, the SCR-508 radios in Sherman tanks were the unseen conductors of victory. They allowed courage to become coordination, and coordination to become progress. When veterans later spoke of Normandy, they didn't describe the thunder of guns first. They described the voices. So many voices, one recalled. Different accents, different units, but all of us talking the same way. That same way was the triumph of communication discipline, the invisible edge that defined the modern battlefield. By nightfall, as fires burned along the horizon, Sherman crews still whispered through the nets. All units check in. Copy. All present. Those small confirmations, simple, human, were the true signal of success. In that shared silence after battle, the radios stayed on. No one wanted to turn them off, because for the first time, victory had a sound. And it was the sound of connection. Winter, 1944. The Ardennes forest stood quiet, a deceptive calm before chaos. The Americans believed the German army was finished, but in that silence the enemy was listening. On December 16th, the German counteroffensive erupted, the Battle of the Bulge. It was their last gamble, A storm of armor and snow. Blizzards grounded Allied planes. Radios froze, and the entire front shuddered under surprise attack. For the first time since Normandy, the communication net of the US Army began to falter. The silence, the same silence that had crippled the Germans months earlier, was now striking back. Across the fog-covered forests, Sherman crews struggled to maintain contact. Snow-muffled antenna signals and ice-shorted circuits. Static filled the airwaves. Can't read you. Repeat. Repeat. The cold was merciless. It froze wires, drained batteries, and swallowed voices. In the early hours, some American tank units fought without radio for the first time in months. They realized what their enemy had lived with all along. German panzer divisions advanced through the mist with brutal speed. Their own radios, simplified for short-range command, worked well in dense terrain. For a few days the tables turned. The Allies faced disarray. The web of coordination stretched to its breaking point. In the town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was encircled. Messages were relayed by runners, just as in the old wars. The sound of connection was replaced by footsteps on snow, yet even in the chaos, fragments of the network endured. Sherman tank platoons improvised, stringing antenna wires across vehicles, borrowing batteries from half-tracks, warming transmitters with field stoves. It was endurance through adaptation, a lesson they had once taught the enemy. By the third day, the snow lifted. Radio operators wiped frost from their sets, tuned back into the net. Thunder 1, this is Eagle. You still there? Affirmative. Holding Bastogne perimeter. The first clear message after days of static. It was not poetry, but to those who heard it, it was hope. When General Patton's Third Army began its push north, the restored communication grid turned the tide again. Each tank movement synchronized with artillery barrages and supply drops. Aircraft returned to the skies, guided by precise radio beacons. The German advance began to fracture. Their fuel dwindled. Their silence returned. Captured German officers later described their surprise. They seemed to rebuild their entire command overnight. They hadn't. The network had never truly died. It had endured the storm. Behind every transmission was a soldier refusing to surrender to silence. The Battle of the Bulge became not only a clash of armies, but a test of communication itself. The Germans had gambled on weather and confusion. The Americans responded with discipline and adaptation. It was the invisible duel between chaos and clarity survived. When the skies finally cleared, the Allied radios filled the air once more. Move, counterattack, drive them back, and they did. From Bastogne to the Rhine, the restored momentum of sound reclaimed Europe inch by inch. Historians later called it the second victory of the Sherman's voice. The first was Normandy, the second, the Ardennes. The lesson was the same. Machines win battles, but communication wins wars. By the spring of 1945, Europe was no longer divided by front lines. It was divided by communication. The German army, once the model of precision, now existed in fragments. Each division fought alone, unaware of the other's fate. The Allied network, by contrast, pulsed like a single living organism, a web of connections spanning thousands of miles. From London command posts to tank crews on the Rhine, orders and reports flowed with seamless rhythm. It was the final stage of a war fought not only with weapons, but with coordination. The Allies no longer just advanced, they orchestrated. At dawn on March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder began, the crossing of the Rhine. More than 5,000 radio channels buzzed in unison. Engineers directed pontoons, artillery spotted fire, and Sherman tanks waited for the signal word. Cross. When that word came, every engine ignited at once. The river turned into a moving bridge of synchronized motion. Across the water, German defenders could only watch the pattern unfold, unable to disrupt the invisible coordination driving it. It was the sound of the war's end approaching. American tank commander diaries from that day describe the moment in precise tones. No confusion, no delay. Every voice came through clear as day. The SCR 508 radios had reached their pinnacle, not just in performance, but in unity. Each message was a thread in a vast web of momentum. Every thread led east. On the German side, silence grew heavier. Their field networks had collapsed completely. Many commanders resorted to civilian telephones or runners through bombed-out towns. By the time messages arrived, the situation had already changed. The speed of sound had become the speed of victory. When the Allies broke through the Ruhr industrial heartland, the coordination was near perfect. Tanks moved through cities as if guided by an unseen hand. Air reconnaissance fed data to headquarters, which relayed to the front in minutes. What once took hours now happened in seconds. German resistance, still brave, became futile. Their attacks were anticipated before they began. Every maneuver was countered before it unfolded. The decisive weapon was not a new gun or a bomb. It was clarity, the ability to see, hear, and act faster than the enemy could react. In the final days of April, as Allied units approached Berlin's outskirts, radio discipline reached its peak. Code names and brevity codes created a kind of rhythm, a pulse of professionalism, even in the chaos of ending war. Blue 2 advancing. Copy, red lead holding east sector. Confirm artillery lift in 60 seconds. Each voice calm, each word measured. It was not the sound of war, it was the sound of precision ending war. Meanwhile, German signals officers destroyed their own equipment. Transmissions ceased one after another. Silence rolled across the continent. The once dominant voice of the Wehrmacht had faded into static. In those final weeks, the difference between sound and silence became the difference between survival and surrender. When American columns met the remnants of the German army, it was communication that determined fate. One clear message: lay down arms, traveled faster than any shell. Tens of thousands heard it and obeyed. The war in Europe ended not with one explosion, but with millions of radios going quiet at once. The last transmissions from Allied command were simple confirmations. Cease fire acknowledged. All units stand by. Then came silence, a different kind this time. Not fearful, not empty, but peaceful. Historians would later say the radio shortened the war by months. It connected generals to soldiers, airmen to armor, and in the end, man to man. For the Sherman crews who had spoken through noise and fire, that final silence felt sacred. One commander wrote, "We had talked through every mile of war. When it ended, the quiet sounded like the first sunrise. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the air still hummed, not from war, but from signal." Across Europe, thousands of radios continued to whisper, transmitting ceasefire orders, rescue calls, and messages home. The voice that had carried commands for destruction now carried words of peace. In every command post, operators removed their headsets slowly. Some smiled, some wept. The sound of static had become so familiar that silence felt unreal. For the men who had lived through the war of communication, victory was not a cheer. It was a quiet exhale. Sherman tank crews gathered in fields once littered with shell casings. Their tanks rested cold and still, the radios inside humming softly one last time. Red 2 clear. Copy, Red 2 clear. It was ritual, the final call of the net. No one wanted to be the last voice to speak. In the ruins of Europe, communication became a tool of healing. Allied engineers repurposed military transmitters to reconnect cities torn apart by war. Messages once meant for generals now carried names, addresses, and news of survival. Families searched for each other through the same channels that had once carried orders to fight. The voice of war had become the voice of humanity again. At the Signal Corps headquarters in Paris, technicians recorded the final combat frequencies into archives. Each frequency told a story, a specific tone, a pattern, a call sign, a human life. When historians listened decades later, they found not noise, but rhythm. A rhythm of courage, confusion, and connection. The SCR-508, once the heartbeat of battle, was quietly retired. Newer radios followed, smaller, faster, clearer, but every modern system still echoed its design. Clarity, simplicity, communication under pressure. In a sense, every modern signal, from aircraft control to space communication, carries a fragment of that same frequency. Born inside the Sherman. The US Army's after-action reports called it the invisible factor of victory. Not heroism, not numbers, but the ability to talk, to coordinate, to trust through sound. That trust extended beyond the war. In post-war Europe, communication networks became the first tools of reconstruction. Radio stations reopened, telegraph lines were restored, and civilian broadcasting flourished again, guided by Allied engineers. For many veterans, the end of war meant learning to live without the net. They had spent years hearing the voices of comrades in their ears. And now, in peace, the quiet was harder to bear. One former tank commander recalled, "When I came home, the nights were too silent. I missed the hum in my headset. It meant I wasn't alone." Those words capture what victory truly cost. Silence after connection. In the classrooms of West Point and Sandhurst, new cadets studied those frequencies and doctrines. The Sherman net became case study material, proof that communication could shape history as powerfully as any weapon. Engineers called it the first digital mindset, not because of computers, but because of synchronization. The understanding that one signal, shared clearly, can guide an entire world toward order. As Reconstruction began, Motorola engineers, the same team that built the SCR-508, turned their attention to civilian communication. Their work laid the foundation for portable radios, for police networks, for every walkie-talkie that followed. The voice that had once said, "Advance," now said, "All clear." In Germany, too, the silence began to break. Young engineers studied what had failed, the rigid hierarchies, the fragile systems. They learned the lesson the hard way, that no nation can function without connection. It was not humiliation, it was rebirth. The end of the war was not just the end of fighting, it was the beginning of the information age. The same invisible waves that carried orders across Europe would soon carry music, news, and diplomacy. The static of war gave birth to the clarity of peace. In the decades that followed, historians looked back at those tanks, those headsets, those voices, and realized that the Sherman's radio had done something extraordinary. It had turned chaos into coordination, fear into trust, and men into a single connected force. It proved that in the heart of war, humanity survives not through power, but through communication. Every war leaves behind echoes. Some are loud, carved in monuments, remembered in medals, but others are quiet, carried in the airwaves, in static, in the memory of a voice. For the men who fought inside the Shermans, the war never truly ended when the guns stopped. It ended the moment the radio went silent. That silence followed them home, an invisible companion both comforting and haunting. Decades later, surviving tank crews described how sound defined their war. Not explosions, not gunfire, but voices, calm, clipped, familiar. Driver steady, loader ready, fire when clear. Those words still echoed in their dreams, not as commands, but as reminders of connection, of the people who once shared that same frequency of life and fear. Historians often speak of strategies and technology, but the veterans remembered tone, how a voice could calm panic, how a single word could mean survival. In their memoirs, many wrote that they never felt alone, even surrounded by chaos, because the headset always carried someone else's breath. One veteran, interviewed in 1984, was asked what courage meant. He didn't mention medals or orders. He said, "Courage was hearing someone say, 'I'm still here.'" That, perhaps, was the true victory of the Sherman. Not in armor, not in speed, but in humanity's refusal to fall silent. As years passed, museums began restoring old Sherman tanks. Many were rebuilt for display, painted, polished, motionless. But the most moving restorations weren't visual. They were auditory. Curators repaired the intercoms and the SCR 508 radios, allowing them to play the faint hum of static once more. Visitors stood before the machines, listening to that low hum. No words, no dialogue, just presence, the sound of memory itself. In a small exhibit at the Imperial War Museum, an old radio headset plays a loop of recorded crew chatter from 1944. A calm American voice says, "Hold position Blue 2, steady as she goes." The message repeats every 30 seconds. It has been repeating for years. The museum staff never turned it off. They say it reminds them that the past still speaks, softly, endlessly, if you listen closely enough. In the archives of the US Signal Corps, dozens of reels of wartime communication remain preserved. Faded tape, coded messages, even accidental laughter caught between commands. To historians, they are data. To the men who recorded them, they were life. Every voice had a face. Every face had a moment. Every moment carried across the invisible bridge of radio waves. The science of war has moved on. Satellites, encryption, digital networks, all faster, sharper, quieter. But speed cannot replace connection. And in that truth lies the legacy of those early communicators. They proved that technology without empathy is just machinery. Connection, the will to hear and be heard, is what makes it human. Today, when soldiers or pilots speak across encrypted channels, they are still part of the same lineage. Descendants of those who first learned to trust a voice in the dark. The war taught the world that survival depends not only on strength, but on clarity, on words shared between fear and faith. Every generation inherits that lesson. In every control room, cockpit and field post, a quiet principle endures. Communication saves lives. That truth began long ago. Inside a tank rumbling through the mud of Normandy, carrying 5 men and 1 voice. When the last of those men passed away, historians played their final interviews on museum loudspeakers. Their words filled the halls like ghosts, not haunting, but guiding. One said, "We were never the best tankers. We just talked better than we fought, and that made all the difference." The audience fell silent, not out of sorrow, but understanding. Because in the end, that was what the war had always been about. Finding each other through the noise. Every war leaves behind echoes. Some are loud, carved in monuments, remembered in medals, but others are quiet, carried in the airwaves, in static, in the memory of a voice. For the men who fought inside the Shermans, the war never truly ended when the guns stopped. It ended the moment the radio went silent. That silence followed them home. An invisible companion, both comforting and haunting. Decades later, surviving tank crews described how sound defined their war. Not explosions, not gunfire, but voices. Calm, clipped, familiar. Driver steady. Loader ready. Fire when clear. Those words still echoed in their dreams, not as commands, but as reminders of connection, of the people who once shared that same frequency of life and fear. Historians often speak of strategies and technology, but the veterans remembered tone, how a voice could calm panic, how a single word could mean survival. In their memoirs, many wrote that they never felt alone, even surrounded by chaos, because the headset always carried someone else's breath. One veteran, interviewed in 1984, was asked what courage meant. He didn't mention medals or orders. He said, "Courage was hearing someone say, 'I'm still here.'" That, perhaps, was the true victory of the Sherman. Not in armor, not in speed, but in humanity's refusal to fall silent. As years passed, museums began restoring old Sherman tanks. Many were rebuilt for display, painted, polished, motionless. But the most moving restorations weren't visual. They were auditory. Curators repaired the intercoms and the SCR 508 radios, allowing them to play the faint hum of static once more. Visitors stood before the machines, listening to that low hum. No words, no dialogue, just presence, the sound of memory itself. In a small exhibit at the Imperial War Museum, an old radio headset plays a loop of recorded crew chatter from 1944. A calm American voice says, "Hold position Blue 2, steady as she goes." The message repeats every 30 seconds. It has been repeating for years. The museum staff never turned it off. They say it reminds them that the past still speaks, softly, endlessly, if you listen closely enough. In the archives of the US Signal Corps, dozens of reels of wartime communication remain preserved. Faded tape, coded messages, even accidental laughter caught between commands. To historians, they are data. To the men who recorded them, they were life. Every voice had a face. Every face had a moment. Every moment carried across the invisible bridge of radio waves. The science of war has moved on. Satellites, encryption, digital networks, all faster, sharper, quieter. But speed cannot replace connection. And in that truth lies the legacy of those early communicators. They proved that technology without empathy is just machinery. Connection, the will to hear and be heard, is what makes it human. Today, when soldiers or pilots speak across encrypted channels, they are still part of the same lineage, descendants of those who first learned to trust a voice in the dark. The war taught the world that survival depends not only on strength, but on clarity, on words shared between fear and faith. Every generation inherits that lesson. In every control room, cockpit and field post, a quiet principle endures. Communication saves lives. That truth began long ago. Inside a tank rumbling through the mud of Normandy, carrying 5 men and 1 voice. When the last of those men passed away, historians played their final interviews on museum loudspeakers. Their words filled the halls like ghosts, not haunting, but guiding. One said, "We were never the best tankers. We just talked better than we fought, and that made all the difference." The audience fell silent, not out of sorrow, but understanding. Because in the end, that was what the war had always been about. Finding each other through the noise.